Newlywed bride vanishes on honeymoon with 70-year-old millionaire. True crime mystery. Hook. Imagine marrying a millionaire, only to disappear on your honeymoon. Was it a dark plot, or something far more sinister? Stay with me until the end to uncover the shocking truth that no one saw coming. Samantha felt the cold ocean breeze sting her skin. The honeymoon suite was quiet. Too quiet. The luxurious hotel stood isolated on a cliff, overlooking the dark waters below. Her new husband, Gregory, had been strange the past few days. Quiet, distracted. He was 70 years old, a millionaire. She was 30, bright-eyed and full of life. She had married him for his wealth. That's what everyone assumed. But what if there was more? The last time they spoke, Gregory was sitting by the window, his face pale in the dim light. He hadn't noticed her slip away. Now, as she walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoed off the marble floors. The hotel felt different tonight. Empty, hollow. Something about the air was off. The walls seemed to close in. She stopped at the edge of the balcony, her breath hitching. Below, the waves crashed violently against the rocks. Her eyes scanned the darkness, looking for anything unusual. She was not alone. A shadow moved in the distance, too far to make out, but it was there. Her heart pounded. She wasn't imagining it. Turning around, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the hallway. A tall man, just standing there, silent, unblinking. Samantha froze. She recognized him. It was Gregory, but it couldn't be. He had been asleep in their room just moments ago. Her stomach twisted. She backed away from the edge, her breath quickening. The figure remained motionless, watching her. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. A chill ran through her. Samantha hurried back to the room, her pulse racing. The door was ajar. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the empty space. The bed was made. Gregory's things were gone, but the faint smell of his cologne lingered in the air. Her thoughts raced. What was happening? Where had he gone? The silence was deafening. She felt like she was being watched. A low creak echoed from the bathroom. Samantha held her breath. Slowly, she turned toward the door. It opened. No one was there, but something had changed. The room no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. She needed to leave. Fast. But where could she go? She glanced out the window. The cliff was steep. The ocean too far below to survive a fall. Samantha turned toward the door. Her hand gripped the handle. But as she pulled it open, the hallway was dark. Too dark. Then a voice. "Don't leave." It was Gregory's voice, but it sounded different. Cold. Hollow. Samantha stepped back, heart racing. The voice echoed down the hall again. "Don't leave." And then the lights flickered. The air grew colder. The temperature dropped, a sudden chill seeping into her bones. Samantha's mind raced. She had to get out of there. Now. She sprinted down the corridor, the sound of her shoes slapping the marble floor echoing in the empty space. But when she reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. The lock clicked behind her, and she spun around. Standing in the doorway was Gregory. His eyes were black, completely black, and his mouth twisted into an unsettling smile. "Samantha," he whispered, "you're mine now." Her breath caught in her throat. The world spun around her, and everything went black. In that moment, Samantha knew she had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to turn back. Too late to escape. Her heart raced as she stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. Gregory's figure loomed larger in the doorway, his smile widening. There was something unnatural about the way he moved. His steps were too slow, too deliberate. Samantha's legs refused to obey. The cold air pressed against her skin, thick and suffocating. She tried the door again. No use. It was locked. She was trapped. The shadows around Gregory seemed to stretch, twisting in the low light. His eyes glinted like black pools of ink, devoid of any humanity. "Samantha," his voice was soft, but it vibrated with something dark. "You were never meant to leave." She backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her fingertips brushed the wall, searching for any escape, but it was too late. Gregory stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He was no longer the old man she had married. There was something else in him now, something much older, something much darker. "I've waited so long for this," he murmured, his voice like a whispering wind. Samantha shook her head, her mind screaming for clarity. But the room was spinning, the walls closing in around her. Every inch of space seemed to shrink with each step he took toward her. "No, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Let me go." His smile never faltered. "You are already gone." With a final step, he was right in front of her. His cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, tightening like a vice. Samantha gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. The air around them grew even colder. Her limbs began to feel heavy. A strange numbness crept into her fingers, her legs, her chest. It was as if the life was being drained from her, slowly, methodically. The more she fought, the weaker she became. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and she collapsed. Gregory bent down, his face now inches from hers. "Samantha," he whispered, his voice low and guttural, "you were always mine." Her body trembled, unable to move. Her breath slowed. The room darkened, her world narrowing. And then the lights went out completely. The last thing she saw was Gregory's twisted smile. And then nothing. Silence. Darkness. Endless darkness. She was gone. No one would ever know what had really happened. No one would ever find her. The hotel would remain empty. The cliffs silent. And Gregory, forever waiting for his next victim. Days passed. But no one came looking for Samantha. The hotel remained as pristine as it had been on their arrival. Staff continued their duties, unaware of the horrors unfolding in the secluded rooms. Gregory never left the suite. He was always there, always watching. Her disappearance was barely noticed. Her family assumed she had left him, run away with someone else. They never questioned the strange silence that followed. But something was wrong. The town began to whisper. Locals had seen strange figures at the hotel, moving in and out of rooms. Some claimed they had heard whispers on the wind, strange voices carried over the waves. Others said the place felt haunted. But the authorities refused to investigate. No one thought there was any reason to. As weeks stretched into months, a journalist named Claire took an interest in the case. Her gut told her something wasn't right. Samantha's disappearance wasn't just a story. It was a warning. She visited the hotel, posing as a curious traveler. The manager greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the cliffside," he said. "We've had very few visitors lately." Claire felt a chill as she entered. It was eerily quiet inside, almost too quiet. The walls seemed to watch her every move. She checked in, noting how strange the staff acted. They avoided her gaze, whispered in hushed tones. Something was wrong here. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time she turned a corner, a shadow seemed to dart out of her peripheral vision. The lights flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. Claire decided to visit the infamous suite where Samantha had stayed. The elevator creaked as it carried her to the top floor. The hallway stretched out before her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She reached the door. Her hand hovered over the knob, then slowly turned it. The door creaked open. Inside, it was exactly as it had been before. The bed was perfectly made. The air smelled faintly of cologne, just like Samantha had described. But something was different now. It felt colder, unwelcoming. As she stepped further into the room, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. Claire spun around, heart racing. She was no longer alone. In the corner, Gregory stood, his back to her. His shoulders were hunched, and his face was wrong. His skin had gone pale, almost translucent. His eyes were black, pools of darkness. For the first time, Claire understood the truth. Gregory wasn't just a man. He was something else, something ancient, something evil. He slowly turned to face her, his mouth twitching into that same sinister smile. Claire backed away, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she gasped. Gregory's lips parted. "You've seen too much," he whispered. Before Claire could react, the lights flickered again, and the room plunged into darkness. A cold wind whipped around her, and she felt something cold grip her wrist. Her screams were swallowed by the blackness. No one would ever know what happened to Claire, just like no one would ever know what happened to Samantha. The hotel stood silent, its secrets buried deep within the shadows. And Gregory? He was waiting for the next to come. Days turned to weeks. The town moved on, blissfully unaware of the horrors creeping in the shadows. The hotel stood tall against the cliffs, its windows dark, silent. But the whispers continued. They grew louder now, carried on the wind. People started to stay away, sensing something was wrong. No one dared to approach the cliffside anymore. The few who did speak of strange dreams, of figures standing in their windows at night, watching, waiting. And then came the police. A missing persons report filed by Claire's family. They had heard nothing since she visited the hotel. But when they arrived, they found only an empty lobby, a hotel that had been abandoned for years. The staff was gone, the manager nowhere to be found. The police searched, though they felt the strange weight of the place pressing down on them, making them question their every step. But every room they entered was perfectly untouched. The walls spoke of secrets, of lives lost in silence, of a darkness that refused to be seen. They reached Samantha's suite. It was the same as it had been that night. No signs of a struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. The faintest scent of cologne hung in the air. As they examined the room, one officer noticed a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall. A door behind the wallpaper. He pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air was thick with dust, stale and stagnant. The officer's flashlight trembled in his hands as they descended. The stone walls were damp, and the silence was overwhelming. The deeper they went, the colder it became, until they reached a small, underground chamber. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs, pictures of guests, some from decades ago, some more recent, but all with the same unsettling feature. Their eyes were black, every single one. In the center of the room, a wooden chair sat alone. It was worn, ancient-looking, and beneath it a faint red stain. One of the officers recoiled, eyes wide. "What is this place?" he whispered. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered and then cut out entirely. The room was consumed by darkness, and from the shadows a voice echoed. "Welcome back," it whispered, low and guttural. A cold breeze swept through the chamber, and the officer felt the hairs on his neck stand up. The floor beneath their feet began to shift. Slowly, the walls closed in. The officer's flashlight blinked one last time before going out. Then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just a silence that felt as if it were swallowing them whole. The missing persons report would never be solved. The hotel would remain abandoned. But Gregory? He was still there, waiting, watching, for the next unsuspecting soul to cross the threshold. and he always got what he wanted. Always months passed, and the town around the Cliffside Hotel started to fade from memory. The building, once a symbol of luxury and prestige, now stood as nothing more than a haunted relic. The surrounding cliffs, dark and jagged, were all that remained visible from the town. Travelers spoke of the eerie stillness that clung to the hotel, but none dared to venture close. There were rumors, though. A few brave souls, intoxicated by the stories of the old hotel, still sought it out. They came one by one, with curiosity burning in their hearts, eager to discover the truth. But no one ever returned. The few who did never spoke of what they saw. The town continued to breathe, oblivious to the growing collection of souls that had become part of the Cliffside's dark history. Then one night, a storm rolled in. The winds howled with fury, rattling windows and shaking the earth. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the darkened cliffs in brief, eerie flashes. In the midst of the chaos, a car pulled up to the hotel. A young couple, seeking refuge from the storm, stepped out, their clothes drenched. They stared up at the looming figure of the Cliffside Hotel, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "I don't know about this, Sophie," the man, Tom, said, his voice wavering as he glanced at the hotel. "It looks weird." Sophie, ever the adventurous one, smiled, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Don't be such a baby," she teased, pulling her suitcase from the back of the car. "It's just an old hotel. We'll be fine." They made their way to the entrance, their footsteps loud against the wet pavement. The door creaked open before they could knock. A tall, thin figure stood in the doorway. He wore an old-fashioned suit, his face pale and gaunt. "Welcome," he said in a low voice. "I've been expecting you." Tom hesitated, feeling a strange unease coil in his stomach. But Sophie pushed ahead. The man stepped aside, letting them in. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. The lobby was dimly lit, the faint glow from antique lamps casting long shadows across the walls. They checked in, their names scribbled down by the man in an old leather-bound book. It seemed like he had been waiting for this moment for them for years. As they were led to their room, Sophie noticed something strange. The hotel felt off. The silence was too complete, like the walls were holding their breath. But Tom was already distracted, focusing on the storm outside. They settled into the room, the old bed creaking beneath them. Sophie closed the curtains and looked out the window, watching the wind whip against the cliffs. "At least we won't be bored tonight," she said, trying to shake off the growing unease. But Tom wasn't so sure. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The silence in the room grew oppressive, as if the hotel itself were listening to their every move. The hours passed, and the storm raged outside. But soon, Tom's eyelids grew heavy. The pull of sleep was too strong. Sophie, however, remained wide awake. She tossed and turned, feeling something watching her. A presence in the corner of the room. Suddenly, she froze. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave, while you still can." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was cold, like it came from the very walls. Sophie turned toward Tom, but he lay still, unmoving, his face pale. His eyes were closed, but something about his expression seemed wrong. She shook him awake. "Tom! Tom!" she called, panic creeping into her voice. His eyes slowly opened, but they were dark, completely black. Sophie screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. Tom's lips twisted into a smile, an unnerving, unnatural grin. The room grew colder, the air thick with an invisible force. Sophie backed away, stumbling over the edge of the bed. But as she tried to stand, the room seemed to warp. The walls closed in, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable. Suddenly, the door to their room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and shadows seemed to dance along the walls. Sophie's breath came in quick, frantic gasps. She tried to reach for the window, but the air around her was suffocating, closing in with every breath. In a panic, she turned to Tom, but he was no longer the man she knew. He stood now, eyes wide and empty. His form, distorted and blurred, was something else. Something darker. "Tom," she whispered, her voice breaking. The shadow around him grew larger, engulfing the room. And then a voice low, familiar, whispered from the darkness. "Welcome, Sophie. You're mine now." Sophie screamed, but her voice was swallowed whole by the dark. And just like that, she disappeared into the shadows of the cliffside hotel. No one would ever find her. Not now. Not ever. Gregory's waiting room was full once again. The storm raged outside, relentless, as the night swallowed the cliffside hotel hull. Inside, the air grew thick, charged with an unnatural stillness. Sophie's screams had vanished into the walls, absorbed by the darkness that now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The hotel had claimed her. It always did. Gregory stood at the edge of the hallway, watching the door to Sophie and Tom's room with cold, emotionless eyes. His figure blended into the shadows, his body a mere outline in the dim glow of the flickering lights. He had waited so long for this moment, for them, and now, like the others before them, they would belong to the hotel. Gregory's smile stretched, a cold, malicious thing, as he turned and disappeared into the dark corridors of the building. Meanwhile, Sophie's world was fading. Her mind spun in confusion as the shadows surrounded her. She tried to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her. Her legs felt as though they were sinking into the floor, the cold wrapping around her like chains. Every movement was slow, strained. She looked around, trying to make sense of the ever-shifting room. The walls seemed to breathe in time with her heartbeat. The air was thick, like a fog that pressed against her skin. And then a voice, soft, hollow. "Don't fight it." Sophie's chest tightened. She recognized that voice. It was Gregory's. His cold fingers brushed her arm, sending a shock of ice through her veins. Her gaze snapped to him. But his face was not what it had been before. It was wrong. His eyes were endless black pits, the kind of darkness you only saw in nightmares. His skin was stretched, thin, like an old parchment, with cracks running down his face. And his smile, it never stopped. "We are one now, Sophie," he whispered, his voice sending a chill down her spine. "You belong here." A sickening realization dawned on her. She had seen it before. The hotel, its power, the emptiness in Gregory's gaze. This place, this cursed place, fed on them, fed on their fear, their confusion, and in the end, their souls. Her breathing quickened. She couldn't stop shaking. "What do you want from me?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the growing sound of the storm outside. Gregory's smile widened. "You are mine now," he repeated, his voice drawing out each word. "Just like all the others, you will stay with me forever." Her heart pounded in her chest. The walls closed in again, the air growing even colder. Sophie tried to move, to get away, but her limbs felt paralyzed heavy. She couldn't even cry out. A soft, echoing laugh filled the room, and then something shifted behind her in the shadows. Tom. But he wasn't Tom anymore. His body was still standing in the doorway, but his face had changed. His eyes were black, like Gregory's. His mouth hung open, twisted into the same sinister grin. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, no." But Tom didn't respond. He simply stood there, eyes fixed on her, his presence cold and hollow. A coldness seeped through her body, as if something was draining the warmth from her very soul. Sophie collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. But she couldn't breathe. There was no air. The darkness around her had taken it all. Gregory stepped closer, his figure looming above her. "You'll understand soon enough," he said softly. "This is your new life now. You will never leave." Her vision blurred. Her world shrank. The darkness pressed in, suffocating. And just like that, Sophie's scream was swallowed by the hotel. In the distance, Tom's darkened eyes blinked once, but they were empty. Nothing remained of the person he had been. The hotel was full of souls, trapped in the shadows, waiting for the next. Always waiting, and Gregory, smiling in the darkness, knew one thing. The cycle would never end. The storm outside continued its furious assault on the hotel, but inside, the silence was suffocating. The kind of silence that swallowed every sound, every breath, leaving only a cold, oppressive stillness. Sophie's presence, her fear, had faded into the walls like every other soul that had entered the hotel. The hotel had claimed her, just as it had claimed them all. Gregory stood in the dark hallway, watching the room where Sophie and Tom had disappeared. His cold eyes gleamed in the dim light, their depth hollow and endless, like the night itself. It was always the same. Another soul, another lost life to add to the growing collection. Another few footsteps in the long, endless walk of the hotel's history. It had been this way for decades, maybe centuries. No one knew for sure, but Gregory did. He had watched the hotel grow, felt its power, fed it with every life that came through, and he was its caretaker, its keeper, the one who ensured it never went hungry. The door to the room creaked open, a slow, deliberate motion. Gregory stepped inside, his boots clicking on the cold floor. The faint scent of cologne still lingered in the air, mingling with the mustiness of the hotel. Sophie's body lay in the center of the room, motionless, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. But there's something in the air now, something different. Her essence was still there, tethered to the room, to the walls. The hotel was not finished with her yet. Gregory knelt beside her, his fingers brushing her cheek. "You're still here, aren't you?" he whispered. "Not quite gone." And then her eyes moved. They blinked once, then twice. Her lips parted, but no sound came. It didn't matter. Gregory smiled, his teeth gleaming white in the darkness. "You'll understand soon," he said again, his voice like a lullaby in the dark. Her breathing was shallow now, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Sophie's body twitched, her fingers curling slightly, almost as though she was awakening from a deep, dreamless sleep. And as her vision cleared, she saw him. Gregory. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but there was no escape. There never had been. She tried to speak, but her throat felt tight, her voice barely a whisper. "Please," she croaked, her voice breaking. What is this place?" Gregory's smile didn't falter. "You're home," he whispered. Her vision was blurry, but she could see it now. The room was different. The walls shifted, bending like liquid, stretching, pulling in on themselves. And from the shadows, a shape stepped forward, a shadow that seemed to have no end. It moved slowly, a figure emerging from the very darkness of the hotel. It was Tom, but not Tom anymore. He stood before her, eyes completely black, his mouth twisted into the same sick smile that Gregory wore. "You're not alone," Gregory murmured, his voice soft and melodic. "Not anymore." Sophie tried to move, to escape, but her body refused to obey. She could feel the pull, the draw of the hotel, its force wrapping around her like a blanket of ice. Her limbs felt heavy, as though something was sucking the life out of her, piece by piece. Tom, no, whatever he was now, reached out for her, his cold fingers grazing her skin. Her heart raced in terror. "No, no, please," she begged, but the words came out weak, as though they had no power. Gregory stepped back, watching with a satisfied look on his face. "This is your new life, Sophie," he said quietly. "Just like all the others, you'll be part of the hotel now. You'll never leave." Her vision was starting to fade again, darkness closing in on her from all sides. She wanted to scream, but all that came out was a soft, distant whisper. And then the darkness took her. She was gone. Gregory stood, watching as the room returned to stillness. The shadows faded. The walls settled back into place. Another soul added to the collection. Another lost life swallowed by the cliffside hotel. But the hotel was not done. There would always be another soul to claim, another victim to lure into its trap. The cycle continued, and as the night grew darker, Gregory's eyes gleamed with that same empty hunger. He would wait, and the hotel would always hunger for more. The storm outside began to subside, but the hotel remained trapped in a perpetual darkness, its windows staring out onto the now-calm cliffs, as though it had never known daylight. The halls were empty again, silent, but not truly empty. The hotel never was. Another day, another night, the same hollow waiting. Gregory wandered the dim corridors, his steps echoing off the cracked walls. His pale hands brushed against the old wooden banisters, feeling the history, the lives lost, the souls caught in the web of this cursed place. The hotel had become a part of him, and he of it. He didn't need to speak to it. He could feel its hunger, its eternal need for more. And always he waited for the next. There was something almost tender in the way he looked at the empty rooms. Each one was a story, a life, a soul now claimed. It was his job to ensure that those who entered would never leave, to keep the cycle turning. He was the keeper, the caretaker of the hotel's dark secrets, watching as time passed, without mercy. But there was a growing unease in the corners of the hotel, something that hadn't been there before. The walls seemed to creak with a deeper, more ominous resonance. The shadows clung to the air with a thickness that made the space feel even more oppressive. Gregory paused, his sharp eyes narrowing as he heard something. A sound, faint but undeniable. A soft tap, like footsteps on the floor above. He looked up, a slow smile curling across his lips. Someone had arrived. Someone new. He turned, his fingers brushing the banister once more, and made his way silently up the staircase, his shoes barely making a sound on the wooden steps. At the top, the hallway stretched before him, a never-ending passage of doors and shadows. There was something familiar about this one, this particular visitor. Gregory's smile deepened as he reached the door. This one had a different energy. He opened the door gently, the creak of the hinges punctuating the stillness. The room was dark, as it always was. The faint glow of the storm's aftermath barely filtered through the drapes, but it didn't matter. The room was always shrouded in darkness. Inside, a figure stood by the window, gazing out at the distant ocean. It was a woman. She turned slowly when she heard the door open. Gregory's heart skipped. For a moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in years. Fear. But it wasn't the kind of fear he'd come to expect. It wasn't the hollow, terrified fear that came with the realization of being trapped. No, this fear was different. This was a fear that held power, that fought back. For the briefest of moments, she stared at him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him hesitate. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Gregory tilted his head slightly. "I am the keeper of this place," he said softly, his smile curling even more, a trace of admiration in his eyes. "And you are mine now." But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, her gaze unyielding. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You don't own me." Gregory blinked, the weight of her defiance, striking him harder than anything else in years. He hadn't expected this. "Why fight it?" he asked, his voice low. "You'll see. Soon enough, you'll understand." Her eyes darkened, but there was something else there now, a determination. "I've seen enough," she replied coldly, "and I'm not staying. You won't take me." Gregory laughed softly, the sound hollow and rich with dark amusement. "You don't understand," he murmured, his smile growing. "You can't escape." But as he took a step toward her, the woman turned away, walking toward the door. Gregory froze. The door was already open. For the first time in years, the hotel felt unsettled. Something wasn't right. The woman stepped out into the hallway and turned, her eyes never leaving him. And in that instant, Gregory felt the chill of something he hadn't anticipated. Fear. Real, raw fear. Before he could move, before he could stop her, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, leaving him standing in the hallway alone. His fingers twitched as he stared at the door, his mind racing. She had left. She had actually left. Impossible. The hotel did not allow it. The walls, the shadows, everything in this place conspired to trap the souls that entered. Yet she had left. His gaze flicked to the darkness beyond, where the shadows seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, as though they were watching him. Gregory felt a tremor deep inside him, one he hadn't felt in a long time. Something was wrong. A deep, unsettling shift in the very core of the cliffside hotel. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Gregory felt the sting of doubt. But even as he tried to steady his thoughts, the voice of the hotel whispered to him, cold and distant, "She's not gone yet." And as Gregory slowly turned, the dark smile returned to his lips. No, she wasn't gone yet. And when the hotel was done with her, she'd understand. Just like all the others, the hotel was restless. It hummed with a low, barely perceptible vibration, as though it were alive, sensing a shift in the air. Gregory felt it, deep in his bones, as he stood motionless in the hallway. The echoes of that slammed door still reverberated in his mind. The woman she had left, but the hotel wouldn't allow it. Not yet. Gregory's footsteps were silent as he moved toward the staircase, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't want to entertain. For years, he had ensured that no one left the hotel. He had watched every soul that crossed its threshold slip into the void, their essence absorbed by the very walls. But this woman, she was different. She had walked away, unfazed, determined. The air around him grew colder, a chill that seemed to seep from the very walls of the hotel. The shadows twisted, stretching unnaturally, as if something was awakening, something that hadn't been disturbed for decades. Gregory paused at the top of the stairs. Below, the hotel lay in complete silence, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. He could feel her now, the woman, her presence lingering like a scent in the air. She wasn't gone. She couldn't be. He turned sharply, heading toward the back of the hotel, where the old servants' quarters were tucked away. His steps quickened as a sense of urgency gripped him. When he reached the door, it was slightly ajar. A flicker of light crept from within. With one smooth motion, Gregory pushed it open. And there she was, the woman. But she wasn't standing. She was kneeling, her hands pressed to the floor as though trying to steady herself. Her breathing was ragged, strained. Gregory's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, his gaze falling on her. She was not alone. The walls around her began to pulse, as though the hotel itself was reacting to her presence. The air vibrated with an ancient power, as if the very foundation of the building was waking up from a long slumber. And then he saw it. A crack. A deep, jagged tear in the floor, spreading outward like a wound that had just been opened. Through the crack, an eerie, pale light flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows across the room. The woman didn't look up. Her voice, though strained, cut through the silence. I knew it. I knew there was something here. Something you don't want me to see. Gregory's lips curled into a tight, controlled smile. You shouldn't have come, he said softly, his voice dangerously low. Now, you'll never leave. But she didn't flinch. Her head lifted slowly, her eyes meeting his with an unyielding resolve. I'm not afraid of you, she whispered, though her hands were trembling. Gregory stood still, watching her. For the first time in years, he felt something. A flicker of doubt. The hotel was no longer in his control. The crack in the floor widened, the light growing stronger. It wasn't the hotel doing this. It was her. Her presence had awoken something ancient, something powerful beneath the hotel's foundations. The very walls seemed to groan, as though they were protesting the disturbance. Gregory's smile faltered. He knew what this was. This wasn't part of the plan. The woman wasn't a victim of the hotel. She was something else, something more. A figure began to emerge from the crack, slowly at first, a shape that seemed to stretch, like a shadow given form. It twisted, elongated, then finally settled into a humanoid form, a tall, slender figure cloaked in darkness. It had no face. It was the thing that lived beneath the hotel, the one that fed on souls long before Gregory had ever arrived, the original force that the hotel had always served, and it was waking up. The woman stood, trembling but unbroken, her eyes locked on the shadowy figure as it slowly advanced toward them. Gregory stepped back, his eyes wide. The woman wasn't just a soul for the hotel to claim. She was the key to undoing everything he had built, the key to freeing the souls that had been trapped in the hotel for so long. The shadow loomed over them both, and for the first time in years, Gregory felt true fear. The woman turned toward him, her expression steady. "It's over, Gregory," she said softly, her voice echoing through the room. "You've fed it for so long, but it's time for the hotel to feed on you now." Gregory felt the darkness pressing in on him, the walls closing in. His breath quickened, his pulse racing. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen. The shadow surged forward, enveloping him in a cold, suffocating darkness. And in that moment, Gregory understood. He had become part of the hotel. He had fed it, nourished it, and now it was taking him. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the woman, standing in the center of the room, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The cycle had broken. The hotel would never be the same again, and it would always hunger, but now it was no longer just the souls it craved. It would hunger for something more. Freedom. The darkness swallowed Gregory whole, pulling him into its endless void. His body felt like it was dissolving, his very essence unraveling as the hotel's power tore through him. The cold was unbearable, like it was freezing his soul from the inside out. He fought against it, trying to scream, to escape, but there was no escape. The shadow, the force beneath the hotel, had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the darkness receded. The room was still, silent. The woman stood at the center, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on the spot where Gregory had disappeared. The shadows around her seemed to writhe, but she remained unmoved. She had known it would come to this. She had known what she was capable of. The crack in the floor, once jagged and threatening, had begun to close. The pale light that had flickered was now gone. And the hotel, it felt different. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the oppressive weight that hung in the air lifted. The walls, which had once seemed alive with an insatiable hunger, now stood quiet and still. There was no groaning, no deep vibrations beneath the floorboards. The woman took a deep breath, her hands steadying herself as she slowly turned toward the door. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. But as she stepped toward the exit, a familiar sensation stopped her. A whisper in the back of her mind. "You're not finished yet." Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her hand hovering just inches from the doorknob. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. Another presence lurking in the shadows. Something not quite tangible, something watching. She spun around, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, searching. But there was nothing. The shadows were still. The hotel still silent. And yet, she could feel it again, closer now. The floor beneath her feet trembled. Not much, but enough for her to notice. Enough for her to know the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch further, creeping along the edges of the walls. They were alive, watching, waiting. And then, a laugh. Low, haunting. The sound seemed to come from all around her, echoing in the room, vibrating through her bones. The woman's pulse quickened. She knew that laugh. She recognized it. Gregory. But he was gone. She had seen him consumed, swallowed by the darkness. "Don't you think it's a little too late for victory?" the voice whispered, threading its way through the room. It wasn't just Gregory's voice. It was something older, something deeper. The woman's breath hitched. The hotel hadn't been completely freed. Not by her, not yet. It was still here, alive, still feeding, still hungry. She stepped back, the hairs on her neck rising. The walls seemed to pulse again, the very air vibrating with a low hum. And then the temperature in the room plummeted, a biting cold that sent a shiver down her spine. "Leave while you can," the voice taunted. But it wasn't Gregory's anymore. It was something worse. A dark, ancient presence that had been lurking in the depths of the hotel, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now, freed from the hotel's long, suffocating grip, it was growing stronger. She turned, instinctively rushing for the door, her hand gripping the knob tightly. But the door wouldn't budge. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she pulled harder. The door rattled, but it refused to open, the shadows seeming to press against it from the other side. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the room darkened once more, the walls shifting, reshaping themselves, trapping her. She could hear something now, scraping sounds, dragging footsteps, the whispers of something ancient moving behind her. A figure emerged from the corner of the room, its form dark and undefined, but unmistakably there. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence filled the room like a shadow that stretched far beyond its size. The woman backed away, her chest tightening with fear. "Why are you still here?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The figure didn't speak. It just watched her, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. The air around her felt heavier, the temperature dropping even lower, until she could see her breath misting in the air. "You can't leave," it murmured finally, its voice like the sound of chains scraping against stone. "Not until we're finished." Her eyes widened as the walls seemed to close in, the hotel's grip tightening once again. No, she couldn't let it happen. Not after everything. She had to get out. With one last desperate push, she lunged at the door again, her fingers slipping against the cold metal as she pulled with all her strength. The dark figure behind her moved closer, the sound of its footsteps dragging across the floor echoing in the stillness. But this time, the door opened, just enough for her to slip through. Her heart slammed in her chest as she tumbled out into the hallway, the hotel's cold breath at her back. And as the door slammed shut behind her, the last thing she heard was the whisper of the shadow's voice, promising her that this would never end. Not yet. You're never truly free. But the woman didn't stop. She couldn't. She ran. And as the sounds of the hotel faded behind her, she knew one thing for sure. The hotel might have let her go, but It would always find a way back. The woman's feet pounded against the old wooden floors, her breath shallow and frantic. The hallways of the hotel seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting in impossible angles, making her feel disoriented, as if the hotel itself was shifting, refusing to let her escape. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Her mind raced, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. She had come so close to breaking the cycle, so close to freeing herself from this cursed place. But it wasn't over, not yet. As she sprinted down the hallway, the echo of her footsteps was swallowed by the oppressive silence, the shadows pressing closer with every step. She turned a corner, her hands shaking as she reached for the door, but when she yanked it open, nothing. Just more hallway, endless hallway. The walls seemed to close in around her, the temperature dropping with each passing second. The air was thick, heavy, as if the hotel itself were breathing in rhythm with her frantic heartbeat. She spun around, her back to the door, and that's when she saw it. The shadow. It was at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the dim light from the flickering bulbs overhead. The same dark figure from the room, the one she had barely escaped, and it was getting closer. Each step it took echoed like the sound of chains dragging across the floor. The thing's body moved unnaturally, its shape fluid, as if it was made of the very darkness it stepped through. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and despite the distance between them, she could feel its presence suffocating her, pushing her to the edge of insanity. "You think you can escape," the shadow whispered, its voice a low hiss, like wind through a cracked door. She turned and ran again, her feet slipping as she tried to make sense of the maze of corridors stretching out before her. She had no idea where she was anymore, no idea how to escape this nightmare. The hotel, the creature, it was all the same. It didn't matter if she knew where she was going. The hotel would never let her leave. It never let anyone leave. She could feel its eyes on her, watching her, waiting for her to break, to surrender. She slammed her shoulder into another door, throwing it open, but there was no escape. The room beyond was more darkness, more walls closing in on her. No. She couldn't let it win. With a cry of frustration, she slammed the door behind her and turned to face the room, desperately searching for a way out. Her eyes fell on the window. She ran to it, her hands trembling as she yanked the window open. The night air rushed in, cold and bitter, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed through, her feet hitting the outside ledge with a sickening thud. She was on the edge now. Below, the cliff dropped sharply to the black waters far below. The wind whipped around her, pushing her back against the building. But she didn't care. She had to escape. She took a deep breath, her heart racing, and then she jumped. The wind rushed past her, the cold air biting at her skin as she fell. The world spun in a blur, the hotel's dark silhouette above her growing smaller and smaller, until a flash of light, and the ground was coming up far too fast. Her body slammed against something hard, stone or rock, or she couldn't tell. Everything was a blur of pain and panic. For a long moment, there was only darkness, and then a sound, a voice. Running again, the woman's eyes snapped open. She was lying on the ground, staring up at a sky that was both too close and too far away. The stars above her blurred in and out of focus as her body screamed in agony. She tried to move, to push herself up, but her limbs felt like lead. Her chest heaved with each breath, but there was something else, something she couldn't explain. The air felt different, heavy. She could hear the sound of soft footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, the same dragging noise from before. She managed to sit up, her head spinning as she struggled to focus. And then she saw it. The shadow. It was standing over her, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light, as if the night itself had taken shape and walked into her reality. "You thought you could leave," the voice whispered again, its tone almost amused. "But the hotel never lets its guests go." The woman's heart stopped. She had fallen, hadn't she? Fallen far enough that there was no way she could have survived. And yet here she was, back again. No, she refused to believe it. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the ground, her eyes darting around the dark landscape. There was no cliff, no hotel, nothing but endless, empty void. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the shadow loomed closer, its presence suffocating. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it would never stop. The hotel would never stop. She would never be free. The shadow crouched down, its face so close now that she could feel the cold seep into her skin, the void pulling at her very soul. "You're still mine," it whispered, its voice like a dark lullaby. And the woman, with her last ounce of strength, could only whisper back, her voice hoarse and broken, "Not yet." But deep down, she knew. It would always be not yet, and there was no escaping that. The cycle had begun again. The woman's breath came in ragged gasps as the shadow loomed closer, its presence so oppressive that it felt like the very air was choking her. She tried to push herself to her feet, but her body refused to obey. Pain shot through her limbs, the impact of her fall still too raw, too fresh. She had escaped once, but now, here she was, back in the grip of the thing she had tried to outrun. The hotel, the shadow, everything was twisting, closing in, suffocating her in the void that had become her reality. "You can't fight me," the shadow whispered again, its voice like the scraping of metal on stone, cold and unforgiving. "You belong to the hotel. You always have." She trembled, unable to speak, unable to think clearly. Her mind was spinning, each thought a dizzying whirl of terror and confusion. She had to escape. She had to find a way out. But the shadow's voice seemed to seep into her thoughts, filling her head with darkness. "You know this," it continued, its tone almost tender now. "You can't hide from me. Not from this place." The woman felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the very earth had become part of the hotel, part of its eternal trap. Her eyes flicked around, but there was nothing. No horizon, no sky, just the endless, oppressive weight of the void. Her heart thundered in her chest as the shadow drew nearer, its form becoming clearer now. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and twisted, as though it had never known a human shape. Its face, or what could be called a face, was a void, a gaping blackness that seemed to absorb all light, all hope. The air turned even colder, the shadow's presence filling her with an all-encompassing dread. She could feel her will weakening, her body growing colder, more distant. Everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, felt insignificant now in the face of this thing. It was too much. The woman's vision blurred, and she fought to stay conscious. She couldn't give up now. She couldn't let the hotel win. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she forced herself to her feet, her hands shaking as she wiped the blood from her lips. The shadow was still there, looming, watching, waiting for her to break. But she refused to surrender. "You're weak," it hissed. "You'll never escape me." Her mind flashed to the hotel, the labyrinth of corridors, the endless halls, the cold, suffocating rooms. She had been trapped inside those walls for what felt like an eternity. But somehow she had escaped once. She had made it out. And now she would do it again. The woman took a staggering step forward, her feet unsteady but determined. She didn't know where she was going. Everything around her was darkness, a void. But she felt the pull of something, a flicker of light, of hope, hidden somewhere in the depths. She wasn't alone, though. She never had been. Behind her, the shadow growled, a deep, guttural sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through her. But she kept moving, stumbling forward with every ounce of her remaining strength. She didn't care if she was lost. She didn't care if the hotel was pulling at her.